All right, so let's talk about the Enneagram a little bit. There are a number of things I'd like to talk about. You know, when people talk to me about the Enneagram, often it's online. Obviously, it's often online because that's what the Enneagram community has become in some sense. There are in person groups, there are practitioners who work with people individually, but like with any field, we now have Facebook being used for marketing. So, we previously thought Facebook was about friendship, but it's not. It has become a marketing platform, and I know because I'm in marketing myself in my job, and Facebook has become about marketing. So you can see the Enneagram professionals go online. Everything filters into the online world on some level. The Enneagram has gotten really, really big, largely because of online word of mouth, just digital marketing basically. So I think it's really important and extremely valuable to break it down, look at it for what it is, look at it from a big picture level, and I'm somebody that can do that. Some people who interact with me online, they don't take me seriously, and they don't really know who they're talking to in terms of the story that I have and the value of that story for the Enneagram community. The study that I've done into it has been self-taught, essentially, and through lived experience. I'm not a professional. I feel a conflict with professional Enneagram folks on some level because I have issues with how it's taught. I have issues with the material that has become mainstream and has become accepted. It's it's a field that I'm extremely fascinated by on an individual level, but a little bit like, say, music, which I'm also passionate about, or counseling, mental health, I'm passionate about. I don't really find it that interesting of an idea to try to navigate the professional landscape and to go professional, so to speak. I just don't. I don't agree with the status quo, and I know I'm going to have to fight an uphill battle to try to work with what is a less popular model, albeit one that is very valuable. I know it to be valuable because I integrate the Enneagram into my life, and people don't realize that it is serious, and my experiences with the Enneagram have been life-changing, and my insights into the Enneagram underground, as it were, are information that really should be brought to light and deserves to be brought to light. So basically, let's talk a little bit about the situation as a whole. Ichazo started the Enneagram, and most of the core Enneagram theory was already in place by 1968, which we can learn in this book. And Ichazo now, thankfully, has a few other books out. These were released by the Erica School pretty recently, I believe last year. And prior to that time, they were kept there. They were taught in a kind of academic setting there at the school, but they weren't released, widely disseminated. And the core theory involved the 9 types, known as the fixations, 9 fixations, and plus the trifix, right? So that would be 81 combinations. And Ichazo believed that was enough. So think of it as 81 personality types formed by combining different elements from 3 centers. It was a balanced, robust system of spiritual and psychological self-understanding. It focused on autodiagnosis, which is self-diagnosis, and this is based on the idea that it has to be useful for us. It's a very humanitarian perspective. It's the autodiagnosis model was designed to combat any authoritarian or tyrannical tendencies that have become rampant in communities where some of these core values were not upheld. Granted, many professionals do still talk about autodiagnosis, and it's worth acknowledging that Ichazo mentions that you may need a professional to help you. At the time, it was about going through the school, and it's a little bit like Scientology in some ways, in that you can learn from a book what you need to learn, but the idea was to get you to go through steps and lessons with, a qualified teacher in the Eureka School. So this idea of, one Enneagram authority, as it were, becoming an authority and having some authority over another person's type was sort of in the cards from the start. It was a potential pitfall, and it became more of a pitfall as time went on, because it's very easy for a power grab to happen if you have people that want information. People desire information about themselves, desire info, and the Enneagram does not give it to you instantaneously. As you can see, we have books. Logically, you would need to read the entire book, really. You would have to develop an understanding of the types, a good understanding of the types. You might be able to do it quickly. You might. It's true. But to really ascertain this for yourself, it does require a great deal of insight into yourself and into the system. In particular, insight into the original system. Because if you look at it this way, we have Ichazo in the center, and he impacted the entire Enneagram on some level, although most of it goes through Naranjo. Naranjo was the main passageway on, but it all went through Ichazo originally, and Naranjo felt that he had some things to add to Ichazo. I actually like Naranjo. I like to use the two of them together, which isn't necessarily something you see all the time, but my reasons for it are that I feel Naranjo did extensive research that helped complement Ichazo. Ichazo would disagree. I know that, my beliefs are somewhat controversial, probably to the Ichazoans, but I think it's okay to use just Ichazo, and I would also find it okay to use Naranjo. I would find it okay to use whatever you want to use, but it's important to understand that for the most part, Naranjo added onto Ichazo. He added 3 subtypes, the instinctual subtypes, which were based on the 9 fixations. So he added those for a total of 243 combinations. So now we've got 243 combinations. And I feel Naranjo fleshed out theory and added dimensions that were already, already being developed by Ichazo. I personally feel they worked well as a team, and the early school that Naranjo worked with and the other professionals within that school all had a fairly cohesive vision. They didn't stray too far off the beaten path of Ichazo and Naranjo together. Okay, so let's talk about some theory very quickly, to go over some theory, which is core Enneagram theory. So here we have the Enneagram. Let's see if we can, I'm not going to draw it right now. I think I'm going to butcher it if I do it. So let's just break it into what I'm talking about in terms of the triads, which is what I really like to talk about here. That's probably the most important part to talk about here. So we have the types. You have 9 here, and it goes around like this, 1 all the way around. I'm not doing them individually, but this is just, representation. And here we have the gut triad, and this is SP, right? Here we have the heart triad. and this is SX, Enneagram of the Head Triad, and this is SO. That was how the instincts were developed, and those are the triads, and this is how the Enneagram is set up. Now, this is thanks to Chazo plus Naranjo. This is what they came up with together, basically. This was the system. Now, Naranjo went ahead and said, look, there's a flow to the Enneagram, and he talked about it as a clockwise motion. This made sense because the type seems to form a narrative from 1, 2, 3, 4. It has a journey, it has a path. You can see a progression among the types. So Naranjo went ahead and added some directionality to it. He also identified directions of integration and disintegration, which are a little bit confusing. I won't go into how those were derived or theories on that right now, but one important thing to acknowledge is that this was something Naranjo came up with. This was one of his rules. This is one of his laws. And therefore, people who built off of him and reject it, it needs to be understood that somebody like R&H is rejecting it. They're rejecting a good deal of this motion for a couple reasons. One is the way R&H handle wings. R&H believe in both wings, so you now have 18 variations, whereas Naranjo felt that there really aren't wings. The wings are symmetrical, they're balanced on either side. You have one type, let's say you have the 8 here, between 8 and 9, you have 7 here. The wings of the 8 are 9 and 7, but you cannot favor, say, a 9 wing or 7 wing. The natural progression of the Enneagram disintegrates this way. This is a kind of a disintegration. Just as a growth is clockwise, a disintegration happens this way. So we're more fixated to the left. We become more gripped, basically. The number to the left is a sticking point for us, and therefore, if we had to add a wing, it would be best, for formal purposes, to choose the left wing. Okay, so, and in many cases that actually holds up, that the left wing is the more common subtype. Not always, but for me, I think for the sake of convention, there's something about that resonates with me on a logical simplicity level. Because what happens if you have an 8-wing 9 and a 9-wing 8 and a 9-wing 1, the apparent quote-unquote or relative so-called distance between an 8-wing 9 and a 9-wing 8 in this representative space is small. It is actually the same as the distance between the 8-wing 7 and the 8-wing 9. So what this does logically is it says that the 8-wing 7 and the 8-wing 9 are just as different as the 8-wing 9 and the 9-wing 8, because you eventually reach a point where you cross from one to the other. Moving these boundaries around made it very hard to distinguish the types, I feel. And I believe that this, too many variables-ness of the whole thing, adding these weird wings that weren't part of Naranjo's idea, that contradicted it, that was one mistake. That was not saying I hate R&H. There are good things about R&H, but we'll talk about what I feel are the mistakes on a logical level. You can't expect the system to continue to work the same way if you break from some of its natural fundamental laws as they were defined in the first place. Similarly to how you wouldn't just add another type, or you wouldn't change these triads around, there are certain conventions that I feel, and many others feel, really should be left in place for optimal functioning and application of this system, which already was quite complicated with your 81 combinations with the Chazo. That's why by the time Naranjo came around, I feel these subjects here, between Naranjo and the Chazo and the books they've written, and including a few other authors that were in that school, without breaking into R&H, where these main, breakages off from theory were, this was enough. I believe this was sufficient. And once these conventions were broken with enough, we now had a broken system, a new Enneagram subculture rising, and that was popular in the public eye. and has become more and more popular. But if we have original Ichazo here, Ichazo, and then we have our RNH over here, the Enneagram, it's no longer the same Enneagram. It just, over time, it has not been done properly. Too much was broken from Ichazo and Naranjo and the Eureka School. That core group, that model that was developed really more in the 60s and 70s, that was in place. RNH's books, I think, came around in, was it the 80s or the 90s? It was definitely after, and they introduced some brave new ideas. And they were very successful at getting the Enneagram out there, and I think it was their marketing. It seems like the vast majority of people that you talk to will be more aware of the model that they put forward, which involves both wings, and it doesn't talk about trifix. If you look at it from the level of variables, to somebody that thinks mathematically, which is how this system should be approached, if you look at it mathematically, this idea that I'm talking about, let's say I'm looking at the type 8, which is my type, and I want to analyze different types of 8s. Choosing to break them into a 7-wing and a 9-wing variation, it doesn't make sense that you would necessarily be looking at, how can I put this? Maybe this type is a bad example. What I'm saying is that it's very hard to control for the variables. It's easier with a type that straddles a line so that we can figure out trifix. Like the two, let's say you have a 4, type 4, okay? Now, many people are going to say, I'm a 4-wing 5. How many people have you met online and say they're 4-wing 5? Now, when we read about the 4-wing 5, all these descriptions, how do we know that that's not just a 4, a core 4? Forget about wings, because wings was just optional and it was supposed to be the left wing anyway. So forget about wings. Let's say it's a 4. Maybe it's a wing 3 if it has to be, because that's convention. So how are we not just a 4 with a 5 fix? The fix was right there. The 5 fix was available and all these options were there, and RNH didn't take them. They went for their own method, which broke from Ichazo's original method. Again, they crushed it in a sense. I mean, they not necessarily in a good way. They came up with their own system. On a very literal and meaningful level, this is not the same Enneagram. Okay, so that's important to acknowledge. Now, with that in mind, let's also look at a couple more things. So, my Enneagram story is kind of important and fascinating. So I've known the Enneagram for 18 or so years now. I'm 37, and I first started learning about it when I was 18 or 19 in college. And unfortunately, I was introduced through RNH, as many of us are, who are working with a broken system, a fractured Enneagram that doesn't talk about trifix, breaks things into 2 wing subtypes that contradict the clockwise flow of the Enneagram. And they do talk about the instincts a little bit, which is fine. That was nice they included that, but that's something from Naranjo, and Naranjo uses the left wing theory. So now we see that they were indeed cherry picking. They were picking what they wanted from the theory. And you don't really want to do that. If you're looking for consistency in a robust system that already has at least 81 combos, if not 243 from Naranjo, you don't want to be cherry picking and changing this too much. I think that they were hoping to simplify it in a sense. They did away with the 81, and instead they went for 18 using wing subtypes. And, then of course they added the instincts on top of that, so that gives us 52. But, at the end of the day, 54, my math I'm tired today, 54, okay, and so we have 54 because it's 18 times 3 with instincts. So they gave us 54 if we use the instincts, but they're not the same variations. They are not conceptually the same. They're trying to use the same system, but they're really not the same system. So I see this a little bit like the Wizard of Oz. There's something out front that you see, and you go back and you peel back and you look behind it all with RNH, and you see something that's basically false. I mean, we should be finding Echazo and Naranjo's work behind all of RNH's work, but instead you find that they've just added things and they've come up with their own ideas. So it's quite a complicated system if you look at it, how it developed. It is an occult system, sometimes known as an occult science. It should be understood as similar to other mystical traditions. And I believe that anybody that studies the Enneagram should study other occult systems, should understand what that all means. They really should, because it fits into the mystical tradition. So basically, it explains it too, because now what we have is we have people that are taking this and they're treating it like a cult. I was a member of one for a long time online, a forum called Typewatch, and it was a closed group. Still exists, but it's largely, to my knowledge, is not very active. But there's one guy on there who runs the forum, and he is in charge of everybody's type. He sort of is the authority on their type, and that is the cult leader in a sense. You wouldn't think of it as a cult per se, but it's what it is. And people that don't take it seriously are just being ignorant, selfish. They don't realize what's going on. You know, I was in this group, and I saw some of my hardest times while I was in this group, because I was typed as a 5. One thing, I was typed as a 5-wing 6, of course. Again, that's the non-traditional, right? You wouldn't have a left-leaning wing if you're going to listen to Naranjo. And I typed myself as sexual over social, which is a non-traditional stacking that contradicts the subtypes theory. Because something I forgot to mention is that the instincts also factor into that, the instinctual flow. So if you're an SP, you're going to disintegrate naturally this way, because the missing piece for you is here, is the heart, is SX, just by definition, if you're going to use that basic model. So all self-pres subtypes are SPSO in nature. That's why they were never called SPSO, because it was assumed. It was implicit in SP. That's why all the SOs are SOSX in conception, though it's not mentioned. It's a little bit like how in the new stackings, they don't mention the third one because we just infer it. So if you follow the laws in the first place, the only 3 stackings are these 3, what was come to be known as the synflow stackings. Those are the stackings that agree with early theory. So introducing the other stackings led to something very similar to what happened with the wings. It was contradicting earlier material. So on the one hand, we want to use this system, the Enneagram. On the other hand, we're saying, but no, I don't like aspects of it. It's hard to say whether it was done in good faith or whether it was done, in bad faith. I don't even know if it is worth distinguishing between those two, because the outcome is the same, which is that the system became broken and it became used for increasingly destructive purposes. And again, if you're going to deny that that's going on, you're just denying direct experiences I have had. I was in a group where, this system was not only used, but it was taken to the extreme with new bells and whistles, where individuals on the forum now came up with things called subwings. You can actually read. I have a book. One of them wrote a book now. I've tried to stay friends with him a little bit. We've had a very, very conflicted relationship over the years. And he wasn't mistyped significantly, although he does claim they got his stacking wrong. But he wasn't mistyped in a serious capacity as I was. But he's written a book with the subwings, and he hardly talks at all about Echazo or anything. I mean, what he does is he talks a lot about the types and goes on tangents of his ideas about the types, and it's not rooted in the core theory. Most of it is rooted in RNH theory, which introduced all these new complicated devices, which can be useful, but they're not as central and as cohesive as something from Echazo and Naranjo. So I would recommend anyone studying it to sort of mentally figure out, how these different authors presented their ideas. What was unique to Echazo, to Naranjo, to Maitre, to RNH. Figure out, how they differed, and understand that you cannot ascribe to all of them. You may be able to do some cherry picking with what works and what doesn't work, but some cherry picking is completely illogical. Like to use things from RNH and then to use the basic from Echazo, they're just going to contradict one another. So if you're trying to work with something that's contradictory beneath the surface, you're only going to be dealing with madness. Just because you can't see the contradiction on the surface doesn't mean it isn't there. There were certain rules and laws of the Enneagram that were put in place, and without those, it starts to collapse on itself. Now, in this group, when I was in Type Watch, one gentleman on there killed himself. I was extraordinarily depressed during some time on there. Luckily, I did survive. I was suicidal for a very long time. I had some good times as well, of course, but they became dead ends as I worked with a Type 5 model and didn't acknowledge that I'm actually an 8 and that I needed to work with Type 8 issues. It's convenient because the 8 has aligned to 5, and I also believe I have the 5 fix. That's my current best theory. So it would make sense that 5 would be a big identification for me. Of course, after a year or two of studying RNH and getting to Naranjo and starting to get to the more core theory, I started looking into other types more seriously, and 8 did stand out to me. Of course, I didn't explore 8 to the fullest because 8 was gate kept on this in this cult. It was run by an 8. He wanted to gatekeep 8, and there were no other super powerful aggressive 8s on the forum. There were some, but they were kept beneath him, and he had the power. He's the moderator. So I personally believe him to be a kind of a con artist, somewhat of a narcissist. I think he probably likes to control people, and I believe he lied to many of us on there. So it was a closed group, and you think you're just learning the Enneagram, but other things are slipped in there. And the idea is to isolate somebody within a community, and they don't ascribe to other views, and they come to trust the cult leaders, the authority. It operates in a very 6-ish way, but also a social variant way, because we want to fit in, we want to get along with others. So yeah, there are people who are set on typing me as a 5. Not that many people, but they are fixated on it. I don't think they could ever see me as another type, and if they did, it might take them years, and they would act as if, it's up to them to decide, it's not up to me. They have it's a completely backwards system, because that's basically what the leader, the model that he uses, and people that follow him use the same model. So they become like little miniature versions of him. You can see in other members, myself included when I was on there, was a tendency to gaslight the types, to gatekeep, to assume that you're not looking at a real 8. A real 8 is considered extremely rare on this forum. 8s are assumed to be mistyped 6s. A self-typed 8 is assumed to be a mistyped 6. And 5s and 4s are very similar. People are expected to be, most of the time, a 3, 6, 9. It's these underlying ideas that were perpetuated and propagated. And you can see them. You can see them in pretty much any online community you go into that isn't strictly professional. The strictly professional ones, they vary. Some of the professionals are just as toxic, but others are very careful not to gatekeep. And they probably use a more watered down version of the Enneagram, because I don't believe the material from Echazo and Naranjo is widely taught. It's a little bit too difficult. It's a little bit too unbiased. People like cultural biases. They like stereotypes. What the Enneagram has turned into is largely a study of cultural stereotypes, how people like to label others, hierarchies of people and what they're good at. There are these silly ideas like, if you're an 8, then you're functional in a certain capacity. none of which is here in Achazo. It's something more spiritual and psychological. The fixation is internal. It's not about, what your job is, whether you're the CEO of a company or whether you're a garbage man or whether you're an artist. It's not about your occupation. It's like people got confused largely because R&H made these big changes. It was the changing of the names. It started as we moved through Achazo, Naranjo, all these guys in the Erica school. It started there when things started to get changed too much. And what we came out with on the other side was something, kind of absurd. It was this distorted conception of the Enneagram where the four, if you're a four, then you're like an artist. It's like this very narrow conception of the types. The portraits that are defined there by Riso and Hudson, and also other authors you can look to from that point onwards and around that time, they can be extremely prescriptive and restrictive. It's no wonder people are mistyped and they're missing out on what's beneath it all. So there are people out there who would love to type me as a 5 or a 6. I believe there's now a movement. It's not a movement. It's just an innate state in the Enneagram community that would want to try to retype me as a 6 because I self-type as the 8. And 8s, for whatever reason, they're not, on a spiritual level, self-typing as an 8 is not welcomed by some groups. I've analyzed it and chalked it up to a lot of things, but I think it might be due to a genuine fear of the type. The type 8 is an aggressive type. They can be tyrants. Some of the biggest tyrants in history were 8s, and I think that the type developed a bad reputation. I don't know who was responsible, but it's their intense moral nature. It can be morality for good or evil, and something happened somehow. So that could be one possibility. Another possibility is that 8s themselves started this gatekeeping. There were enough 8s like the guy in the forum on TypeWatch. There were enough 8s like that who were, disturbed, sort of sociopathic people who wanted to gatekeep their type and wanted to be the superior type and wanted to be the leader. So that happens as well. It's important to acknowledge that. Some people would love to sit here and try to inferiorize me and tell me, hey, look, don't you think that maybe you're just delusional because everyone else is calling you a 6 and you just can't see it? It's like that kind of thinking is something I absolutely hate. And I can tell you, I hate that kind of thinking. I know that Enneagrammer uses that. I've been harassed by people from there saying, oh, they're the best typists, they typed you right. It's like, no, they didn't type me right. I sent them information about myself. I sent them their documents and all of the things they requested, and because I wanted to see what they would do with it. And I was collecting information on them, and they did not type me accurately. That is for me to determine based on auto-diagnosis. So people have it backwards. They think now everything's shifted. So the auto-diagnosis has been crushed. You have people coming along saying, hey, I want to know my type, because they want information and they don't want to read a big book and they don't want to study and learn. So they try to take shortcuts. They try to go to the professionals. And largely the environment out there is incredibly toxic. Nobody wants to do the work. The Enneagram is being abused and it's causing problems for people. If you get really into the system, you can end up like I was, a complete mess. I mean, sometimes I was 300 pounds or I was, 130 pounds. I was addicted to drugs. I was unemployed. I was depressed. I was suicidal. I was homicidal. I was struggling. I was screwed up, in so many ways, but I was on this forum going, yeah, I'm the type 5. I'm just trying to get my life online, trying to get my life on track. I guess I just need to integrate to the 8, I mean, it became very cultish, and we can all be gripped by that. It's not just a core type 6 that would do that. We all have all the types in us. I think that it pulls on that 0.6 or that 0.9 or that 0.3. Those are the cardinal points that make us want to conform, to fit in. But all the types are just variations on those core points. So this could happen to any type, which is why I don't buy another argument somebody might present, which is, well, look, James, don't you think the fact that you fell for this, that means that you're a 6? Like, no, that's not accurate logic either. It's funny because people don't think clearly or logically about many things, and they have their own agendas that they want to push on you. Now, I'm not interested in pushing anything on anybody else. I'm just letting you know what has worked for me, and I have reasons to believe it. And it's it's from the original theory. It is supported by others. I've worked with this model, with the subwings and, vibe typing and just kind of weird stuff that people online came up with for years. And that stuff can work okay, but you have to break away from that movement, because the people that do this stuff, like Enneagrammer and Typewatch and other groups, they believe in this authoritarian top-down approach where you don't get to type yourself. So if you're going to make some of their theory work, you have to be willing to take that theory and say, look, guys, I trust your theory, but I don't trust you. So it practically demands cognitive dissonance. It's okay to use their theory, but don't use them. Use autodiagnosis, because now you see how it becomes contradictory. And once you lay it all out there on the table, it is profoundly contradictory. And it makes a mockery of the Enneagram, and it makes a mockery of the people who are involved with the Enneagram. So that's why I prefer to, keep it simple. It's already a complicated enough system. If you want to use wings, go for it, whatever. But don't sweep trifix under the rug. I mean, the trifix was identified as, the second most important thing after your core type. We all have all three centers in us. That was the whole point. One dominates, but if you're a gut type, a type 8, that doesn't mean you don't think rationally, that you don't have, a fixation in the head triad. An 8 with, say, a 5 fix like I have can be very intellectual. To add another layer of intellectualism, you can include Naranjo's social subtype, which is how I tend to type myself, because I'm more intellectual for an 8. So I have the 5 fix and I have a social variant, which is the 5 was identified as sort of the most intellectual in the intellectual center, and the social subtype was identified with the intellectual center. So, you can see how these are layering of different variables and elements. It's important to stick with the conventions and use those elements appropriately so that we can understand the system from the same perspective. Now, I don't hate or dislike people that use the other methods. Probably a few weeks ago or a few months ago, I was, trying to find my way through those as well. All I'm saying is that it never hurts to just simplify. You should be able to work with this system in a simplified form. It should function that way. If it doesn't, you're not going to get better results by making it more complicated. I mean, that's just common sense. So I would recommend working with the simpler format. Use autodiagnosis. Some of this nobody, some of this no one has an issue with, because they haven't really been sucked into some of the groups I've been sucked into. But it's amazing. I don't think people would mistype themselves hardly ever until they started going online or going to professionals or going out into the world, and their autodiagnosis methodology and system was being, was being harmed in some way, was being interfered with in some way. So now we have the tools. We have the cortex. We have occulted teachings from Achazo that have been released. We have, great text by Naranjo. It's been out for a long time. Courage and Neurosis, very good book. We have a number of books by Naranjo. So we have several books by these main guys. We have several other books by some of their students, and we have a big wiki online that was put together, books worth of information studying the subtypes and the types, and from every angle. So with all of that in place, there's basically no need for somebody like RNH. I would recommend only reading these texts for curiosity's sake and to get what's out there, and for whatever benefits they do offer. But in terms of really understanding the Enneagram, you want to understand how it started, what the rules were, and what it is. I don't like to see how it's being used. I think it's harmful. I was in that group. One man took his own life. He was very depressed. Clearly the group wasn't helping with that. He was very into the group, and he had some tensions with the leader as well. Another guy actually killed himself because he wasn't led into the group, because it was a gate-kept group. And then there was me, who simply was doing okay until my life started to fall apart. My girlfriend left me. That was extremely depressing for me, all because I couldn't see my fixation. I was playing somebody else, basically, which anybody can do, but a social subtype is at a greater mercy for that, especially the social 8, because they like to appear nicer to get along with people. The 8 is potentially a very aggressive, destructive, lustful type. They go against society, they're rebellious, they do things their own way, but the social 8 compromises that somewhat, but it's mostly on the surface. So it really kind of worked out for me to take on the identity of the 5, especially as a 5 fixed 8 and a more intellectual 8. And by theory, the 8 does lean into the 7 wing. So 8s do tend to be fairly intellectual, even by classic theory. They often have a strong 7-ish component and will lean on 7 quite strongly because they might be struggling to integrate their type 8, which really also integrates to the 9 as we mellow out and learn to relax and get along with people, and integrates to the 2, which are both positive types, are both outward-oriented types, giving to others and getting along with others. So that's really how the type 8 integrates. When I meet people who identify as 8 wing 9, that's all well and good. I can parse some 9 influence in them, that's fine. I'm not denying that that's what they're like, but I wonder how much of it can be explained by the other fixed points, how much it can be explained by an instinct without having to introduce this wing 9 unconventional. It's like we came up with a new idea when there were already other ideas at our disposal that could explain it. So, all right, that's what I've got for now. Hopefully that makes sense. And, talk to you.